Hi, my name is Aindri
And I'm Mahak.
and welcome to another episode of All About That Reef.
Today's episode is really special because we take a look at a specific marine challenge, but we try to understand it from a lot of different perspectives and really look at how it is that we can solve the problem from at its core itself. And so basically, I think that brings us really nice to the topic of discussion, which is the idea of systemic solutions. So just for context, as I was saying, systemic solutions is looking at not just sort of treating the symptoms or treating the immediate problem, but really understanding what the root cause of a problem is, the sort of system that creates the problem itself, and all of the different aspects that this system includes, like its stakeholders, like aspects such as education, feedback loops, all sorts of different mechanisms.
And also to understand it from like a holistic view, like it's a 360 perspective of different aspects to just one marine challenge that we have right now in Sri Lanka.
And yeah, it's really interesting because I think when we think of conservation in Sri Lanka, when we think about the challenges we have, we find that in Sri Lanka people are very reactive as opposed to proactive. So they see a problem and then they're trying to sort of fix that problem then and there, but nobody looks into seeing how that problem can be avoided in the first place, or how sort of situations can be molded to be able to ensure that the problem is mitigated in the long run, in the future. So yeah, I think it's really nice that we get to hear from someone who's working in
on
this
a project
space.
like this.
And is also like has sort of worked through a project like this, has the experience, and also is looking at a problem, which in our case is abandoned, lost and discarded fishing gear, from so many different lenses, and really trying to understand and break it down, but also make it palatable to the community, make it palatable
and how you bring
to
awareness
the
to it,
general population to it.
So shall we just give them an idea as to what abandoned, lost and discarded fishing gear is?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty self-explanatory. It's basically when the fishing community uses their nets, which you might not know if is actually made out of plastic in most instances. Like that's the main polymer that's used in the fishing nets, and often sometimes these fishing nets get in a state of repair, so they get abandoned or discarded. Sometimes nets just break when they've been put into fishing and they end up lost, and what you have free floating fishing nets that are found in the ocean ecosystems, or they could be attached to the substrate, like coral reefs. And obviously it's not great having fishing gear in the water. Like thinking about the environment, like just off the top of my head, like entanglement of marine life, like especially like turtles, is like such a big sort of harmful effect of fishing gear, but also it has impacts on people's livelihoods, right, and like the economy of the country, because if you're going to have fishing gear, then you're going to have bycatch, you're going to have like unwanted, indiscriminate capture of marine life, which then obviously reduces the fish stock that's available for fishermen, and then that affects the income they generate, and it has all sorts of like ripple effects.
And while you were like speaking about all of this, while we dive even at shipwrecks, there's so much of ghost gear that has been like entangled in these shipwrecks in Colombo and like in the east and in coral reefs as well. And because we are aware of all of this, every year when the season is coming to an end, we organize like an underwater cleanup. But I think this is a question for her as well, the guest that we are bringing in. I just want to know, like, what are the ways in which, like, I'm pretty sure there's no exact solution to like how you can properly recycle this discarded fishing gear. But like her opinion and her perspective on how underwater cleanups, the effect of underwater cleanups and how it works, and the steps we should be the proper steps we should be taking while doing these projects.
Yeah, honestly, I don't have an answer myself, so I think the best person to ask would be her. But just what I do know is that because it's like plastic, it's actually made from nylon 6. So these fishing gear that are collected can actually be sort of processed and recycled to be converted into virgin nylon 6, which is then used heavily in the garment industry for like apparel production, which is also such a big industry in Sri Lanka, right? So we know there is a solution that can be implemented, and then there is the problem. And I think the question now is also like, how do you
interconnect
the problem to the solution and sort of figure it out, right? And I was also just thinking, when you were talking about shipwrecks and coral reefs and the places you dive being covered in fishing gear, that's also another problem, right? Because it leads to habitat degradation, and also if you think about it from an entanglement, but also from like an ecotourism point of view, like nobody wants to dive in places. I mean, I'm sure some people will dive, but like nobody wants to really go and dive in places that are like depressing and covered in fishing net, which then again affects like the economy, and like with Sri Lanka trying to promote tourism to such a great extent, and sort of cleaning up the seafloor, I think is a big part of it. But rather than just cleaning up the seafloor, going the next step and figuring out what to do with all of the materials that have been cleaned up, but also going a step back and seeing how is it that we can stop the problem from happening in the first place.
And while you speak about this as well, and I think you mentioned how you bring awareness to it, and how you can make sure that the general public are aware of these situations and these challenges that we have in Sri Lanka within the fishing community. And one way that like some of us would do is, when we go underwater, we will take pictures and videos of like plastic underwater and like these entanglements, and like whenever we go diving, at least one fish is entangled in a net, and that would speak words. I mean, that speaks for itself, kind of thing. So like also the guest, I think she would also have a perspective on how she communicates the work she has done and the projects that she's working on right now. So that would be interesting.
I think for real, like I think she's great at the sort of storytelling aspect. And we've spoken about storytelling in some of the previous episodes with the underwater photography especially, and like how important that really sort of inspires people to take conservation action, or like you know have some of those lifestyle changes, behavior changes, and live a little bit more of a conscious life. But I think it also, when you look at it in terms of like a very specific marine challenge like this, it does so much more, you know, like it really sort of helps address the root cause of a problem. Because like honestly, like until I started working in this space, like I always knew marine litter was a big issue. I knew like plastic pollution, microplastics, nurdles, like I'd heard of it all, but I never stopped to think about the fact that there might just be like lost fishing gear in the oceans. You know, it's not something you really think about very often.
Also, because the fishing industry is a huge industry,
especially for a country like Sri Lanka.
It has been going on for like years and years, and it's not just like these daily fishermen that go out. It's just commercial fishing and like these big vessels that have big nets.
Like the size of football fields.
It's massive nets, and like there's always an entanglement when it comes to this big like fishing gear that you see out at sea.
And then it also comes back to the question, right, like who is now responsible then for this fishing gear in the ocean, and whose responsibility is it to clear up the ocean? Like can we expect the fishers who are doing the fishing to be responsible for the sort of ensuring that it doesn't end up in the ocean, or like ensuring it's get processed? Is it the government? Is it like the consumer? Like I think it's really like, because nobody talks about it, because there's no information on it also, that there's also this passing on of the burden of this problem to different people, and then nobody's really doing anything about this.
Shout out to Pass It On for sponsoring this episode.
And now we're back. Today we have joining us Hafsa Jamel, who plays many different roles in the conservation space in Sri Lanka. So Hafsa, thank you so much for agreeing to be on this episode. We're really, really excited to hear everything that you have to share with us. Just to start off, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got involved in the conservation space in Sri Lanka?
Sure. Hi, my name is Hafsa, and firstly, thank you so much for having me on your podcast. It's been a while. Mahak's been talking about this all the time at LEF. My background has been within the development space. I started with a bachelor's in international development, and then worked a little bit in the humanitarian spaces in Sri Lanka, which allowed me to really have a good understanding of the non-profit organizational structures. And then after graduating, I got a really great opportunity to work in marine conservation. I think that's where it just won my heart over. Ever since then, it's been trying to find more spaces and avenues and ways that we can contribute back into conservation and marine conservation, which is so important right now, especially in a climate where working with the environment is so essential.
Yeah. Could you tell us a bit about like the projects that you are currently working on?
Yeah, so at the Lanka Environment Fund, I work in the capacity of a programs manager, and I was brought in on one of the bigger projects called MARESSOL, which is the Mannar Region Systemic Solutions project. That is a collaboration between 4 organizations, 2 in Sri Lanka, so that's the Lanka Environment Fund and IUCN, one in Tamil Nadu based in India called SDMRI. It's facilitated by an organization called SALT, which is based in Norway. And essentially this transboundary project was initiated or created to kind of address or understand rather what abandoned, lost and discarded fishing gear was, what the impact was on Sri Lanka's coastlines.
Yeah. Okay, interesting.
Yeah, that's definitely interesting. And so ALDFG, or as you said, abandoned, lost and discarded fishing gear, is obviously like a really big problem that's growing worldwide, but it's a particularly urgent problem in Sri Lanka as well, right?
Yeah.
So from your experience working in the project, can you dissect for us a little bit as to what ALDFG is and why it's such a big problem in Sri Lanka?
Okay, so the project itself, MARESSOL, went on for 4 years, and the first 2 years was basically scientific research to understand the composition of macro debris that was found along Sri Lanka and southeastern India's coastline. And what they've realized is that almost 40 to 50% of macro debris is actually ALDFG. And it's really concerning because we don't have disposal facilities for fishers to actually get rid of their nets, which further contribute into like open water dumping and an increase of ghost gear within our like ocean spaces as well.
Yeah, when you mentioned this, I didn't know it was that much of a percentage, and I've seen so much of ghost gear like on the shipwrecks that we dive in, just in Colombo as well.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's a huge problem that we have just in Colombo. Obviously, you probably know more about like the impact it has on like the whole of the island kind of thing. But what are your thoughts on like underwater cleanups and how does that benefit any of like the
Well, it's definitely a solution for ALDFG. Like after all, if there is free floating gear, it has to be removed from an environment. I think the controversy here is that we just don't have, one, the disposal facilities at harbors and landing sites to take care of the problem, and 2, we don't have strong recycling solutions to address it in a circular economy kind of way. But I think whilst this area is still fairly new, it's still important for us to take care of the environment that it's deeming such a huge threat in, and removing it is the best way to do it. And of course, like having trained professionals doing it is the only way to go.
And I'm sure like abroad there are so many like case studies that you have also like you know about that are like big companies like Adidas and all recycling all this like ghost gear and things like that.
Yeah.
Do you think it's hard to start it up here or like?
Well, I think it's more about the quantities, right? Like if you think about it, Sri Lanka is a pretty small nation, and that contributes back into how much recycling companies or industries are willing to operate at. So for example, when MARESSOL ran the figures of how much ghost gear or net could be collected in a given year, they estimated a number that was about 25 metric tons.
Okay.
But for a recycling company to recycle nylon 6, they need 25 metric tons a month to fulfill the operations. So there's a huge discrepancy of how much we're actually collecting or that we can collect in the island right now. And it goes back into how much the lack of baseline data sets that we're operating with. So I mean, you said, you know, I probably know a lot more about the nets, but really we don't. Like,
Really?
that's the thing, there hasn't been a lot of research done to quantify the numbers. And it's only been a lot of observational case studies that have been coming out. And I think in the past 2 years has been the periods in which a lot more organizations have been funded into doing projects of this scale, and that there has been an increase of like necessity to start looking into this space as well.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
I think.
I mean, obviously, ALDFG is a big problem in Sri Lanka's waters, and it seems like while it is a problem and we have the solutions, because we don't have it at scale, like you said, that there is very little that we can actually do with the nets that we are collecting right now. So when you were working on the MARESSOL project, what was the sort of outcome of the project, or like were y'all able to identify a solution? Were you were y'all able to fill in the gaps with the data that you said, because you all said for the first 2 years you were doing research. So could you just talk us a little bit through the outcomes of the project?
Yeah, so essentially there were two really great deliverables that came out of it. One was this policy approach that IUCN really pushed for. It was a creation of a national advisory committee that's headed by the Ministry of Environment. And essentially what the NAC, or the National Advisory Committee, is a collection of government institutions and departments, private organizations, recyclers, all involved in trying to find a way for everyone to come together and create a solution. Which is important, and you bring everyone to the table for them to be able to voice their concerns. So for example, there could be people who are collecting nets and were promised that nets would be collected or picked up from by a recycler, but because of logistical issues, it just doesn't happen, or that there is a delay in it happening. So there are so at least there's a space that people can come to the table and voice their concerns, and also suggest different ways that they could participate and integrate solutions in a more systemic way. And through that process, the NSE also put together a standard operating procedure of how they could address policy. So for example, integrating more gear tagging regulations within the fisheries policy was one that's important. And I think having that out, laid out as a framework is important now more than ever, because now we know what the next steps are and what that roadmap looks like. Along with that, I could just talk about the awareness component as well.
Yeah. Before you go there, just for our listeners, can you explain a little bit on what gear tagging is and why it helps important with ALDFG tracking?
Yeah, I mean, it's so simple. It's self-explanatory. It's literally just tagging your gear. And
how do they normally tag it?
You just tag it with, so for example, if it's a line, you can have a buoy that's spray painted with a number. So you have your vessel number, and then there's a specific code that the Department of Fisheries would give you.
Okay.
And all of those things, all it does is that if you lose your gear, there's a higher chance of someone being able to find it and return it back to you if it's registered within with the Department of Fisheries as well. So in this sense, we can always keep a track of where gear is getting lost and how far it's also traveled. So it provides a lot more data points for us to work with, and understanding how ghost gear even travels around Sri Lanka.
Have you all got data as of now?
No, but I think there are a few organizations with, I think, Dr. Steve, for example, Pelagicos, they've been doing a lot of gear tagging and trying to support the Department of Fisheries in getting more gear tagging systems out, because it's interesting, right? It's not just a tag, you're still thinking about this tag in open environments, salt water, it can get faded, so they're looking at different solutions of different types of paints, materials that can withstand it in a long period of time.
Interesting.
Yeah, and sorry, before I cut you off, I think you were going to talk about the awareness component that MARESSOL had. I think the ALDFG toolkit maybe. So
yeah, that was a fun one.
Yeah,
it was really fun because I guess when I joined MARESSOL, so they were done with the research, and basically we had the final report with all the evidence, right? And the next steps was to kind of network within the industries to understand who's doing what within the space. So not just it being local solutions, but also global solutions. And I think that's where like the Conservation Collective, which is LEF's like umbrella organization, what they've been able to do is like leverage a lot of their international networks into keep getting us conversations with like Barreo, for example. So Barreo is a company that recycles fishing net back into nylon 6. And they sell it to Patagonia, major outdoor brand, and this whole product passport is like catching up within these spaces as well. So it provided like a really nice traceability solution for it.
Nice.
Yeah.
So we've spoken a lot about MARESSOL, and I think it has been like really useful for us, and I think it seems like it has gone really well, especially considering the fact that in like a lot of our previous conversations with people in like who work in the conservation space, there have been a few general sort of challenges that have come up each time, like one being that everybody works independently. There's a lot of like organizations that have similar mandates but they don't work together, so there's a lot of replication of work, or there's like even people not communicating with each other, and that being a challenge, and that seems to have been addressed by the National Action Committee. And then there's also issues of data, the lack of data, which again, it seems that MARESSOL is sort of filling in that gap. So just to keep building on that, to understand whether there are any other challenges that you have seen when trying to sort of deal with ALDFG in Sri Lanka, that like challenges in tackling this as a sort of conservation challenge.
Also because you're working with different, you're working with different like people. You're working with the government, you're working with like organizations, you're working with businesses. So it'll be interesting to know like.
Well, I think what, like you were saying, like the NAC does provide a really great space for people to come together and communicate more than they usually do. That being said, there is still a lot of like leniency, or just like not being able to cooperate within these spaces, because it's just the way things work sometimes.
And you're bringing so many different players
in,
so it's hard
the
to get
dynamics, the thought processes. Everyone has their own agendas, right, at the end of the day. And what we're trying to do is kind of push forward the conservation narrative and say, if everyone comes together, at least in this space, we can achieve one common goal. And that's kind of like the ultimate finale of it, like being able to create a solution that runs by itself seamlessly. And I think like probably your questions over here is like, how do all of these players kind of interact with each other in this space, right? Like it's not easy, of course, and I think government will always focus on like policy and making sure that there is proper enforcement in their capacities, within their resources, all of that, and you have to kind of play ball within that system as well. And then businesses, obviously very profit driven, they don't have a lot of background in how they can push the conservation narrative through their work, and I think that's also super essential. Having a more development focused pathway forward, especially within this space. But I mean, after all, like it is something that we need to also navigate. And when you go down to the community levels, for them, I think it's all about just being heard, right? And providing solutions that fit within their lives seamlessly, so that we don't have to provide things to them for them to kind of adjust to. So I guess even with the, like, I think I didn't talk too much about the awareness component, but what we managed to do was kind of put together a tool book or a handbook that kind of compressed all of the resources that we were able to find whilst we were looking into what kind of resources were out there. So from just general awareness posters of like the life cycle of ghost gear in the ocean, to how to tag your gear effectively. Like, so we took the government, the ordinance acts of like, you know, the correct way to tag it, and usually it's really like boring black and white, it's the gazette notification.
Yeah.
So we were able to extract all of that into like a to-do list, and then came up with like a little cartoon of these two fishers who basically was like, oh, now I need to tag my gear. How do I do that? And then they'll go and they'll look at, oh, so these are the sizes that need to be measured to, and this is what needs to go on it. So it's very visual, it's very pleasing. It kind of pulls you into the story and the narrative of exactly what needs to be done. And I think one of my favorite parts of this toolbook was obviously the workshop, right? So we created this very low-cost theory of change workshop toolkit, which basically encourages fisheries department officers and youth organizations to just run workshops within their area. And we're not thinking about a larger picture, but it's just about looking at the stakeholders within the room. So even if it's from like school clubs to maybe like the Pradesh Sabha official who's sitting with you, like you think about your capacity. What can you bring to the table first? What do you have within your own power? And then let's talk about the gaps. And then through those gaps, how do we fill those gaps in? And then we give them more resources to like a directory of like, you know, if you want to reach out to someone within the research space, like you have all of these lecturers who are working with ALDFG. If you want to look at NGOs, these are the people who are affiliated to NGOs working within this space, funding organizations, government officials, all of that. And we also have a Google Drive folder with like some of these soft copies of everything that they could find within the book so that it's printable. And I like to call it photocopy friendly. So because essentially it's just you take the book to a communication shop and you can photocopy it and then you blow it up or whatever and you can stick it around your schools, your local communities.
Amazing. And I'm guessing it's in all 3 languages as well?
It's in English and in Tamil.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, definitely really cool. I think there was a lot to unpack in that, and it's really nice.
One more question.
Yeah.
Where can they get this handbook from?
It's on the LEF website under resources, so we have a soft copy over there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. we can link it onto the YouTube video. We'll do that. But yeah, so as I was saying, a lot to unpack in everything that you just described. But before, like one of the things I do want to talk about was a lot about how you said the storytelling element, and I think we can get to that a little bit later. But first, the what I really liked about everything you said was that it was a little bit different. You know, it wasn't the most straightforward solution that everybody goes into every time they look into it. Like usually if you're taking like a conservation project, then you're going to have a workshop, but then the workshop's going to be like you teaching fishermen on why ALDFG is bad, as opposed to doing like a capacitating the capacitators, you know,
like training
sort
the
of
trainer.
Training the trainer, that's the word. So you don't really see people doing that or looking at it in a way of like them realizing what their sort of capacity is, or like what their role in it is, and then providing them the resources to be able to do it. So I think that was really cool, and it gets me a little bit to thinking about how it is that you designed this solution, right? Like how is it that you all decided that this was a good way moving forward? And what you did mention is that you were working with communities and you were trying to see how to fit a solution to what the community has within their means to be able to do, rather than having them adapt to like a larger solution that you would design from, you know, Colombo or a head office or like a researcher without any of that on the ground reality. So can you just talk a little bit about how you have maybe engaged community stakeholders in this regard, and also while you're discussing that, talk about maybe the different lenses that you look at these community interactions and stakeholders through?
Yeah, so I guess one reason why it's only in English and Tamil is because we created this for Mannar, right? Mannar is predominantly Tamil-speaking community, and English was honestly just for the funders. It was for the government officials, anyone to, you know, to put that out there and to say that, hey, this is what we've done. So we did print out like a lot more copies in Tamil than it was in English, and English was just for the resource people who we had to distribute it to. And in that process itself, I think one thing that we really tried to focus on was understanding that the community themselves, it's not like they don't know right? It's blatantly obvious, and like these issues have been coming up over and over again.
Yeah.
So coming to them saying, okay, listen, like this is bad for y'all, they'll be like, yeah, okay, but then what?
Yeah.
And then it's about giving them the power or that understanding of being like, listen, y'all being a part of the fishing community, like what can we do better? Like what are the solutions that y'all need right now? Like why is this as bad as it is right now? And they'll tell you it's that they don't have proper disposal facilities. There's like 20 harbors in Sri Lanka and over 900 landing sites, and landing sites are essentially strips of beaches along our coastline. Like how do we even enforce something of that scale, right? How do we have material recovery facilities to even like understand that scope and space, or to even create logistical solutions to go and pick it up from every single landing site, every single harbor. And then there's a bigger problem over there of how clean nets have to be to actually be recycled. Like you were saying, you know, when it comes to cleaning seabeds, does it even make sense to remove the net if there's no recycling solutions right now? For me, I'm like, just get out of the environment, because like the micro shedding in there is probably going to be so much more worse than it would be if you were to take it out of the ocean.
And also the marine animals that get
exactly the bycatch
all the time.
Exactly. Like how many times have you had to like cuddle a turtle out from a fishing net, and how like detrimental is that? How sad is it, right? And I think so just to go back to the quality of the nets that we're operating with and how that is also a problem, it falls back onto the community to clean, sort, and then dispose of their nets. And that's a huge process in itself. And it has to be cleaned to the point where there is no debris. All the weights have to be taken out, and then it has to be sorted by like colors and everything, and that segregation is time and effort. And
very labor intensive.
It's very labor intensive.
And it's like something that you can't expect also the community to do, right? Because
already,
like there's already such a burden on some of the fisher communities in Sri Lanka. Like I think when looking at the sort of angle of also gender in fisheries, and like how already like women in fisheries play that dual role of being caretakers but also being like unpaid fish processors and things like that, and now you're expecting another layer of sort of contribution from them. And I'm also thinking, obviously, a facility of this will have very technical aspects associated with it. Like it's not just straightforward, right? You don't just clean it, sort it by color, and then it doesn't magically turn into nylon 6, right? So what it seems is like the community is aware of the problem, and we're telling the community, don't let your fishing gear in the oceans because it's bad for the environment, but then we're not actually ever giving them a viable solution that they can implement in real life, is what it seems.
I think like it was interesting for me to actually come back to that same thought process that you had, right? And the thing is, what really blew my mind was that, one, we're looking at a solution from an industrial point of view. We're looking at recycling solutions on the larger scheme, but then we met with an organization called Kabadiwala Connect when we were in Chennai last year to talk about like marine litter, and they pushed forward this narrative of like, why aren't we integrating the informal waste sector into these collections, because they do have the technical know-how. They've been doing this kind of work. They work within like waste recycling spaces. And upon like diving deeper into it, you realize that almost 77% of Sri Lanka's entire household waste is actually managed through the informal sector, but only 10% goes into recycling. So there's a mismatch there as well. So they have the capacity to collect, to segregate, to sort, but no one's actually involving them within this space. And I think that also just goes back to those lenses that, you know, we always try to integrate within our work and our solutions, because the more you understand a community for what they are is when those layers get exposed, and then you realize that these are the different dynamics that you're working with. So one is like this huge aspect of informality that is so unique to South Asia, and instead of looking at formal solutions and trying to force that onto our communities who have been operating within informal systems for like generations now, we need to be looking and unpacking what informality looks like, and then curating our solutions to fit the community itself. And then also to go back, Mahak, about like gender and all of that, like Entirely, like, the burden falls upon the woman, because especially even in fishing communities, there's this huge aspect of like superstition, right? Like women aren't allowed to touch boats because they are bad luck. It's pretty bad across the island in different ways. It changes obviously, but you see a lot more gender within, more women involved in like shallow waters, lagoons, estuaries, because it allows them to fish and take care of children. So there's like this multidimensional role that they take on, but it's never one of a provider. It's never one as the breadwinner. But at the same time, they are still the managers of a household. They are the ones who are taking care of finances. They're the ones who are taking care of the waste, or like the household, the waste that's generated by the households themselves. They're taking care of food, literally everything.
And correct me if I'm wrong, I think, are they the ones making the nets as well?
Well,
is there a community that, like
it depends, and I think in some cases, yes, and like that's the thing. So our coastal communities aren't one, it's not the same
standard across
the entire coastline. Every single community that you move across will have different nuances, right, in different ways that they have been integrating within these spaces. So for example, you would see a lot more women involved in selling in the southern parts of the country than you would in the north. In the north and the east. In the north and the east, there are a lot more women who are involved in subsistence fisheries, and they have this really great like communal outlooks where women come together, they fish, they then separate the fish for each other's households, and whatever's remaining is sold, and then that money is again divided amongst women. So there's like this really great like communal element that comes together as well, and all of these stories are very unique to different areas. And I mean, in Nigamo, we've seen men mending their own nets. We've seen there also being a commodification of these skills. So, for example, you can pay someone $3,000 to come and like fix your nets for the day or something like that. You know, like you have these services that are coming out in more like industrial settings, like Nigamo, for example.
That's definitely interesting, because also like you're saying, even though like across the coast, like there's no standard like way that these communities operate. But I think it's a given fact that despite all the different nuances in how they've had the division of labor and their different gender roles, women in every coastal community play some sort of aspect within the sort of larger fishing industry, and often they remain pretty unsung for their services. But I think we've sort of dissected this space a lot, and I do want to go back to the awareness component that you were saying. So so it ties, I think, really nicely into the work you do at Parrotfish Collective as well as a communication strategist. So could you talk us a little bit through your process on how you break down things and make it a little bit more palatable for the general population, and how that in itself is like a solution to a lot of the challenges that we face?
So I guess with Parrotfish, how I got into this space was just as a writer. Like I just wanted to kind of keep writing about conservation, learning about conservation, and I always thought that like creating elements out of like really cool science was just a really great way to push forward information onto a general audience, right? So when we're looking into communications, especially for like organizations who have kind of worked within these conservation spaces, we take like a bulky report that's kind of boring, bland, kind of locked in that scientific.
And no one reads it.
No one really reads it, but it's still important, right? Like it's still something that needs to be out there, but more often than not, scientists, excuse me, they struggle with creativity, and that's fine, because like having a design element is something that is also something.
It's a skill on its own.
It's a skill on its own. So we essentially try to understand who they want this strategy or this communications output for. Like, what's their general audience? Are they talking to fishers? Are they talking to just the wider public? Are they trying to address local government, students, and all of those demographics? You can convey information in a very specific, strategic way. So then we think about, okay, now what do you want out of this? Like, do you want posters, handouts, a book, right? Like, what kind of resources are you trying to create? And then based off of that, we put together a team of just like brilliant individuals, from designers to illustrators to writers to translators, and then try to bring the project to life basically. And yeah, I mean, that's the schematics
That's
of
interesting.
it.
Yeah. I'm honored that you consider me a scientist. So just going a little bit deeper into what you said. So you said, depending on the audience you have, whether it's a student, whether it's a fisher, whether it's another researcher, the way you structure the communication differs. So could you give us a little bit of a small example of that? Like, what would be different if you were going to, for let's say, a student versus someone in the community?
Okay. So I think students, like just generally, like off the top of my head, like infographics, right? Like they want all the information, bite-sized pieces. They want to learn about like one specific topic in like 5 slides. So you can really focus on infographics in that sense. Someone from a general public audience who's just scrolling on their phone probably won't go through like 5-7 slides of information, right? So that's not what they're looking for. What they're looking for is one post, probably funny, that's eye-catching, colorful, you know, that kind of like invokes something in you. So cartoons are great for that. There's ways that you can look at like political elements of like cartoons as well, and like it brings about this humor. Like we were doing this campaign with
Taltivu. That was really so just for context, Aindri, when we've spoken about the Vidataltivu Nature Reserve being gazetted like a few times, and as part of the MCSL, which is the Mangrove Conservation and Sustainable Livelihoods Forum, which is a coalition of 6 NGOs, we launched a media campaign. So from LEF, we worked with Parrotfish Collective to do like a few comics to really sort of gauge people's interest. And the 2 that I remember, one was like a student like really excited to go study at the International Climate Change University that, you know, the president at that time was sort of really promoting in all of like his sort of climate change things. And then it's like 4 years later she graduates, and then she's out there and she looks at just like all the devastation in the environment, and she's just like, what did I really study all these 4 years for? Like, what's the point of the university if like the underground actions? So it really highlighted the sort of stark difference between what like top level government officials are promising and what is actually happening on the ground. And the other one was from the point of view of flamingos, and they were talking about like, it was basically like a family, and there was like some baby flamingos, and they were flying and saying, oh, they're really tired and they want to stop and get a rest. And the mother keeps saying like, oh, just a few more miles, just a few more miles. But they can never stop because the Vidataltivu Nature Reserve, which is like an important habitat for migratory bird species, they couldn't rest there because now there was no habitat, and it was a shrimp aquaculture farm. So it was also to sort of get people to think in the perspective of the sort of species, right? And like giving them that like that sort of personhood. Those are just the 2 I remember, but I think
well, there's just one that I thought was like pretty, it was dark humor. I think Zev did this one when the whole like Adani wind farms was coming out. Essentially it's like bird watchers under the wind farms, and then he's like looking up and there's like blood splatter or something, right? And then he's like, what kind of bird is that? And it's flamingo, and it's just like, because you know it's a flamingo in the wind turbines. But it's things like that you can like capture the essence of the problem that's happening right now, and for people to be like, oh my god, like this is actually serious, right? So that's basically how we kind of look at strategies for different demographics and audiences, and it's so important that you actually tailor make it in that way, because there have been so many reports and publications that, you know, get printed at the end of a project that aren't used over and over again. And it's such a shame, because at the end of the day, I think like within the spaces, within this conservation development space, there's so much of funding that's channeled into good work. But then if we're not consolidating,
executing it the way
exactly,
and people are not knowing like giving awareness, bringing awareness to it is so important.
It is.
And also when you were mentioning like how like each person, like from a student to the general public to like a scientist to someone, how they digest this information. And I'm sure now, because Parrotfish has been doing this in like this for some time, they probably have like the particular percentages and audience that they have targeted according to each post. And I guess that information would also be so interesting for other people and other conservation organizations to understand, like, like what works and what doesn't work.
Yeah,
which
that's
is
true,
so
yeah.
cool.
Yeah,
like
yeah. Yeah, I mean,
even looking
everything
at
is
the
data
data
backed.
and
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
That's really cool as well.
It is, because there are some posts that just get like
like major traction.
major traction, right?
There was that one post with this swimming with whales,
Yeah.
right? Like which had absolutely nothing on it. It was just like an icon of like a whale and someone swimming with the whale, and it said it's illegal and had the law underneath it. And I think that had like 2,000 plus likes, so
Wow.
and like 150,000 odd
Yeah.
views. So just like it's crazy also what gets traction and what attracts people's attention.
Yeah.
And like you were saying, like a lot of reports are made,
Yeah.
right? And like they obviously are really important because they have all of like the data and like the methodology and everything. And but when you think about it, like those are important for funders, those are important for researchers, those are important for people that really have the time and resources to delve into it and also to understand everything, because they tend to be like really technical, right? But the idea is to make it palatable and raise awareness on it, then a report isn't going to be worth helping you. So it's really great that an entity like Parrotfish exists in Sri Lanka now. And I think even people that are not in the conservation space, like a lot of people follow it. Like it has really built up that name. And I remember before like Parrotfish existed in Sri Lanka, like I used to follow Green Humor on Instagram. I don't know if you follow Green Humor, but he does like some amazing, he does some amazing comics, but it's like all within like the Indian
spaces,
context, and like so much of it was relevant to Sri Lanka that like it's really cool now to have an organization that's doing the same thing but for like the problems we face. Like, you know, there's a little bit of pride, I think, also associated with that, even though like I have no association with
And I love
Parrotfish.
that it's a collective, you know. And I remember like when I just started working within like conservation, I think we were both, you know, around at the same time, and like Parrotfish, like those posts were always just so exciting, right? Like because one, they are engaging with local designers, like everyone is, you know, someone that you know of, or like it's people who are creative in ways and they just want to be involved. And then if you go to them with an idea, they're like so stoked to actually be a part of it. And it's different, like from photographers to writers, illustrators, artists. Everyone kind of comes on board to bring a vision to life.
That's cool. I think we should get them on board as well for our next podcast.
Next episode. I think definitely there's so much to unpack on the sort of environmental communication
and from a creative perspective.
And from a creative perspective.
And it's not just like science communication that they're pushing. I think science communication is something that they are like pushing for like social media, but there's a lot of also work that's being done within other spaces, like for example like creating logos for national parks.
Exactly.
So
there's also the FEO, invasive species removal projects, right? So they actually go on the ground work as well, and all of that has, I think, again also come through because they've created a space and created a name for themselves within the conservation space.
So I have a few questions. One question is, what's the next step with this fishing gear project that you are doing? So for example, if there's like an organization who has collected some fishing gear from some ghost nets and wants to give it to a company that's recycling it, or where it could be stored, how is that possible? And then from a business perspective, if they want to get involved in a project like this, what are the steps for them?
Okay, so like tricky answer, because again I think we don't have like a proper solution or like a favorable solution, because I think right now given that we don't have a lot of understanding of the quality of ghost gear to send it for recycling, because after all, you can recycle nylon 6. So a lot of the nets that you find in Sri Lanka are made from nylon 6, but then you find other types of fishing gear as well. So you get like buoys, traps, nets, gill nets, fishing line, all of that. So depending on the different type of polymer that it's made out of, it can be recycled different ways. But when it is left in the open environment for a long period of time, there is questions of the quality of it, and recyclers are more averse to picking that up from someone who's doing a cleanup. But you do have people who are incinerating it for co-processing for like waste to energy. So there's INSEE who's working on it. So I think one of those things is to just kind of get in touch with them. If you feel like the net hasn't been degraded, then you can also reach out to some of the recyclers. So there's Wasteless Arugambe, who's doing all island pickups depending on the time of the year. So you can like kind of line up the scheduled pickups with the programs that they're doing. I mean, it's very small scale, but it's really effective, and you have to make those personal connections to these players as well. In terms of storage, I know that Pearl Protectors has a few storage sites across the island right now. There's one in Trinco, one in Colombo. So you could reach out to them and see if they'd be willing to store the nets with theirs as well, because they're waiting for a solution as well. And in terms of like cleaning the gear out of the oceans, I would advise that it's being done with groups that actually do it as a program, because it can be quite dangerous. So you have to proceed with safety, and I know that Pearl Protectors again has created a dive guide into how you can retrieve nets as well.
And also to make sure that when you're cleaning the net, you're not harming the ecosystem that's in, because as you've obviously seen when you're underwater, like it gets very entangled, and like basically you also have the marine life sort of integrating with the nets. So it's also not an easy operation to have the cleanups. The cleanups.
You forget all your diving like rules and regulations when it comes to like, because we do like some cleanups once a year at least every season, during like the Colombo season and also the East Coast season, and you realize like there's so much, like at some point you have to stop, but then it's you basically stop because your air is running out. But there's so much of ghost gear, like in like reefs to shipwrecks, and it's important that we like definitely as a community do like bring awareness to this kind of stuff, and like even with like videos that you put on like social media when it comes to like the pollution down there to like ghost gear and all of that. It just gives people an idea as to how much of nets are like entangled in these shipwrecks and reefs.
Puts it like contextualizes the problem as it is.
And I think it's a really good thing that we spoke about ALDFG or ghost gear today, is because like also plastic pollution has come up in previous conversations that we've had on the podcast. Like when we spoke to Manjuda, I think he said he even has some pictures, you know, of like the impact, and like even Darshana, who was our first guest, when he was talking about shipwrecks, he spoke about it. So it's been a recurring issue that has come up, and it's really nice to hear all of the work that's being done into sort of solving it, and how you're not just looking at getting it out of the water, but you're looking at systemic solutions and like how to actually solve the entire problem as instead of just like solving the immediate root problem. But
one more question about how from all the work that you have done and the projects that you have worked on, and you are also still learning in this like marine field and conservation, all of that as well. But what advice would you give someone who is just starting up? And I mean, I don't know, you could mention this as well, but from what I've heard and learned about you just today, I think you started from a very different field, and now you come to this field, which means that you don't have to be in the marine space from a really young age, or like you don't have to be a swimmer, or like you don't have to like be a diver to save the sea. It could be, so there are so many other ways for you to like
get involved.
Sort of also like giving the sort of early career professional stage that you are in, like taking in some perspective from there as well, and just really thinking about like how someone who's not come from a marine space can still be involved in sort of solving problems that affect our oceans.
I guess one thing that's like, you know, that you're touched upon is that this space is very intersectional, right? Like as long as you have a passion for it and as long as you care, I think that's all that really matters. It can be quite daunting and tough, but I think Well, I think this is something that I've realized, I don't know, like it's like try to give advice to someone and I'm still kind of like advise myself like through this space, right? But one thing I just keep reminding myself is that, you know, you can't rush things, and like where you start is where you start, and how you go through your days is what's going to happen, and like you pick up things along the way and just be really open to learning, be curious, ask so many questions, like just ask as many questions as you want from anyone. And I think one of the things about this space is that the more questions you ask, the more clarity you get, right? Or at least you know who to ask. And that's also really important, because not a lot of people talk to each other, and communicating within the space is also so important. And be brave, like just be courageous to like take those steps into things that your heart really yearns for and cares about, because you never really know where it's going to take you. And I know that that's such a, like it is a privileged thing to say. Like I've had like such luck in when I've like wanted to like move away from a career path, and like I'd move away without having a backup plan, and then suddenly I have a backup plan, you know. It happens so miraculously, but I think for me it's like I always just take the, like I just take a leap of faith, and I hope that something kind of happens along the way if it's meant to be. And like one thing that like has really driven my faith is also just working within nature, and like realizing that nature itself is magical, right? And as long as you can kind of connect yourself to that essence, there's something brilliant that the energy around it is what pushes you through it. Yeah, I think that's basically
For someone who's still giving advice to herself, I think you give some great advice.
Yeah, I thought she was going to say she's so lucky to have worked with me. But
yeah,
that
yeah,
didn't
my
come.
pathway led back to Mahak.
Yeah. Just for context, we worked together at Oceans.
Yeah,
and
I
then
know.
we ended
Maybe you should share.
Sorry, just for context.
You had history.
Thank you, Hafsa. I think we did learn a lot from you today, and I'm really excited to see what people have to take away from this episode. And thank you everybody for tuning in and listening to us.
See you on the next one. This podcast is a CreatorCast production.